Hello, everyone. I am Stephen Acabado, Associate Professor of Anthropology at UCLA. And as mentioned, I am the incoming director of the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I'm an archaeologist, and the discussions today resonated my work in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, especially with agricultural systems and food systems in the region. So I just wished I was able to log in early. uh, Thank you for being with us today, even though it's less than ideal, but I'm encouraged that we would be returning or we will be able to resume some form of normalcy soon. But before we learn about Malacca, let me start by stressing that as a land grant institution, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. As you probably already know from reading the materials for this workshop, Malacca holds a very important place in Southeast Asian and global history. And we're very fortunate that the foremost scholar of the region and time period is here with us to provide insights about Malacca, Southeast Asia, and the world. Our guest speaker is Professor of Southeast Asian History at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His work focuses on early modern history of Southeast Asia, particularly of Malaysia, Indonesia, the southern Philippines, and southern Thailand. He received his BA in history from Yale University and his MA and PhD in Southeast Asian history from Cornell University. He has also taught and held research positions at the University of Malaya, Australian National University, and Auckland University, to name a few. In Hawaii, he regularly teaches history of Southeast Asia, history of Malaysia, history of Indonesia, history of Islamic Southeast Asia, historiography of Southeast Asia, and the seas in Southeast Asian history. He is a prolific scholar with a lot of important publications, including The Kingdom of Johor, The Heritage of Arong Palaka, History of South Sulawesi in the 17th Century, A History of Malaysia with Barbara Watson Andaya, The World of Maluku, Eastern Indonesia in the Early Modern Period, Leaves of the Same Tree, Trade and Ethnicity in the Straits of Malacca, and the history of early modern Southeast Asia are the foundation of our work on this period. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Leonard Andaya. Mahalo.
Right. Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a great pleasure to be able to work with all of you. I understand my brief to be to try to give you some ways of looking at Malacca and making Malacca relevant to your seventh graders. So I looked through the what is required in the oops, I'm really stuck here, but okay, there we go. So one of the things that I looked at was the core questions. There are two core questions. It's under the global convergence 1400 and 1800. And so it fits in with what I'll be talking about today about the early modern period between 1400 and 1830s. And the two questions that they pose, which I will attempt also to try to deal with in this presentation, is one, the impact of human expansion in the voyages of exploration and the impact on the environment, trade networks, and global interconnection. And so here, what they're really looking at is European voyages of exploration, because there is a lot of trade going on prior to the Europeans, and there were trade connections, not exploration connections. And I'll deal with the environment and the in the second part of the presentation. And you can see in everything that I said of the global interconnection. The second question I also deal with in the second part, which is what were the causes of colonialism and the effects on the colonized people? And here you can see the link between the types of projects that were undertaken by the Europeans and this early kind of colonialism. So I deal with that in the second part as well, and try to explain that when you talk about colonialism, you have to be very careful, particularly in Southeast Asia, including Malacca, that there was an earlier form which is better understood through the seaborne empires idea. And so I'll be really looking at that closely so you can see where this goes. And the presentation would attempt to answer some of the things that they wanted. So first, I'll start with the trade, which is an important part of the question, number one question in the global encounters, and to look at the period under consideration, which is the 15th through the 18th centuries. So these are the questions that I thought might be useful for you. In fact, we could even just start now and ask, does anyone know where the Trinity of Spices is? Where do you find clove, nutmegs, and mace? I mean, the original site of clove, nutmeg, and mace. Does anybody know? Okay, so we'll look at that. And then why spices were so important in world trade, and where does Malacca fit in all of this? So let's just go straight then to where are the spices. So one of the things that you could tell your students is that what we talk about as cloves, nutmeg, and mace, the so-called Trinity, the Christians called it the Trinity because they considered it to be so valuable and important, like the Christian Trinity. But we now think of them as, using the cloves, nutmeg, and mace in apple pies and, ingredients that are not that valuable. So why was it that these people started to search for the spices, and how difficult was it to get? So one of the things you can point out is that these areas were the indigenous areas of these plants. So now you can find them in Tanzania and elsewhere, but they were originally only from a small portion of Eastern Indonesia. And so you can see there in the inset where the Indonesian islands that have these spices. So these tiny little islands here are the original areas where the clove tree grew. And the nutmeg tree, where nutmeg and mace came from other smaller islands right here in the Banda areas. So what you have to think about is these were very long distance away from everything. So how did they manage to get these cloves or nutmeg or mace to the rest of the world? Because we know for certain that in the 3rd century BCE, or before the Common Era, or BC, China had cloves. They were getting the cloves from Eastern Indonesia. And so we do know that there was a trade network that got these things from one place to the next. Then on the left is a picture of Tidore. I did research in the Maluku Islands, and so I know this area very well. And what you find is that those little islands, of 5 islands that are the clove-producing islands, are some of the tallest mountains in the world, if you count it from the bottom of the ocean sea to the summit. So what you see on these islands are just the tip of the mountains. And so as you go from the coast to the mountains, it's almost a very quick climb. And then you find these clove forests. And so this is where they are. And they were very, very close together. So this was one of the islands in the background, Tidore, and the island of Ternate is where I took the photo. And so just to give you an idea, again, I think your students would be very interested in some of these pictures. I must admit that these were taken a long time ago. These were in the mid-'80s when I was doing research. And so these are the children who were in front of a clove tree. And so one of the things you can explain to your students is that cloves were everywhere. So people didn't harvest the clove. They waited until someone came to the port and wanted cloves. Then they would go out and then break branches and just bring those branches to the ships. And so you have a picture of a clove on the branch, and I think that would fascinate young people as well, because they don't usually see cloves. If they do see them, they see them in small pieces. Whereas here on the right, in the town of Ternate, they have piles and piles of these cloves that had been dried and ready to be bagged. And so those kinds of things are, I think, very interesting to students. And then if you look at the nutmeg tree, what you have to explain to them is that nutmeg and mace come from the same fruit. And so on the left, you see a nutmeg tree, the branch, with the fruit itself. But in order to get the nutmeg and mace, you've got to split open the fruit. And what it reveals is a nut that's surrounded, it's called an arrow, but you can just say it's surrounded by the mace. The red part is the mace. And so what the people do is to separate the mace from the nut, and they dry both. And then they prepare these for sale. So these are fruit that most children around the world have never seen. And one of the other spices which it becomes very important, although I don't go into very detail, is pepper. So if you think of cloves, nutmeg, mace, and pepper, they were the principal spices that were sold all over the world. And so one of the things that we know about the spices, not pepper, well, pepper as well, I'm sorry, that the reasons why the prices were so high was it was a sign of status for the wealthy. If they could buy these spices because they were so difficult to obtain, it demonstrated a wealth and a power that no one else had. And so they would use the spices for food and drink. Now, there was a belief, it's now been debunked, that the spices were sought for by the Europeans to preserve food. And they found that this was not so. And those who have argued this have gone to cookbooks, and they saw that any kind of rotten meat or meat that was going off was thrown out. And so they were using this really for flavoring rather than to preserve. But one of the things that also became very popular with very little real support or evidence for its efficacy is that some of these cloves were very effective against the cold, all the way up to the plague, could treat all kinds of aches in the body, including eye sores and that sort of thing. And it could even help your eyesight by rubbing the oils on your eye and so forth. But one of the attractions, of course, was it was considered to be an aphrodisiac, which would enhance the pleasures of coitus. And so you have then many people thinking of these spices as being very unusual and even magic-like. So this is something that could be mentioned. And I indicated this picture here on the right, which is from the Book of Hours. And the reason is it was a European perception of the different spices. I tried to find one on the cloves, which I used for one of the books, my Maluku book, but I couldn't find it again. But here is a similar kind of depiction of the workers of the king bringing the pepper, picking the pepper and bringing it to the king. And of course, this is all stylized. And so oftentimes in the Book of Hours, you can have this kind of stylized perception of the Europeans of what it was like to have peppers in the field, which was very unlike the reality. But these would be useful in terms of perception for students. So what is the significance of Malaca then? That was a third question I posed. Today, Malaca is really a World Heritage Site. It's a tourist destination. And so it's very popular among tourists. And what you have here on the pictures on the right are images from present-day Malaca. And what it shows is a very important Malaca River, which is still there. And they reconstructed on the left the Malaca Palace. It was a Malay palace. And what is interesting about this palace, you might take a note as well, is that the actual building of the palace was based on one of the manuscripts. It was a chronicle which gave the dimensions, and the modern day people use the dimensions to rebuild the palace. So you can see if the dimensions were correct, it was a vast palace. It is now a museum, but you can see what it looked like from the outside. And on the right is a mosque, a very unusual looking mosque, mainly because it doesn't have the bulbous dome, but this was a typical kind of mosque earlier. It tended to borrow ideas not from the Middle East, but from India. And so here is the Kampong Kling Mosque, or one of the mosques, important historical mosques in Malacca. So what is important about Malacca is that in the heyday, so between 1400 and 1511, it was a major redistribution center for spices to the rest of the world. And this is what made Malacca very famous and very important. So what I want to do then is to look at Malacca. Why did it become a redistribution center? Why did it become so important in the maritime East-West trade? And so what I pictured here is the area where the East-West trade moved. So it moved really from East Africa, all the way down here, into the Middle East, then to India, and then out through the Straits of Malacca here, and this is Southeast Asia here, and then into China. And why people went through the Straits of Malacca is because it's one of the few openings through the ocean. So you could either go through the Straits of Malacca or through the second strait, the Sunda Straits down here. But most took the straits here. And why they chose that as well is because it was very well protected throughout the year, because there are two major wind systems in Asia. One is called the Northeast monsoons, and then the other Southwest. So they move in different direction and move in a clockwise direction. So one time it moves down from the Northeast, and the other it moves up from the Southwest. But what makes the Straits of Malacca valuable is that it's protected from these very powerful winds because of the mountain chains that run on the spine of the Malay Peninsula. This is the Malay Peninsula, and on the spine of Sumatra, the island of Sumatra. And these two mountain chains protect this area from these powerful monsoons. And so international traders began using the Straits of Malacca from very early on. And so what one needs to do is also to demonstrate to the students why was this so significant, this East-West trade. And the reason is that this was really the entire Asian world at that time, Asian and African world. And so many of the goods from East Africa were getting down to the Persian Gulf here. So they would bring their goods here to the Persian Gulf. And then you got the Persian Arab community in the Hormuz, in this area here, who would then trade to Gujarat here. And then from here, these traders would take various means to get to Southeast Asia and to Malacca. So this was only one from the western part. The second was the most important area, which was India. And so there are three areas, and the way to remember it, because it's difficult to remember all three of these areas, but they were in the northwest, Gujarat, the southeast, which was here, which was the Coromandel coast, and then in the Bengal area in the northeast. So that the three areas were the principal centers of the trade from the west moving into Malacca. And the thing to remember as well is that many of those who boarded these ships to Malacca were of mixed crew and mixed traders. They brought their goods with them and they went on whatever ships would take them where they wanted. And so you already have, just in the movement of these traders, a large number of different groups coming in ships coming to Malacca. So here's the beginning of the cosmopolitanism of Malacca. And if you look from the other side, from the east, the most important, of course, were the Chinese. They were the foremost traders. And the goods that they brought were so valuable that wherever Chinese goods were, it would attract traders from around the world. And so what you have then is the two most important of the Chinese goods. One was silk and the other was porcelain. And you can explain to these students as well, why was porcelain? Today it's a very common form of dishware, but porcelain has to be fired at a very, very high temperature. And the Chinese had perfected the method, whereas most others didn't. And so they didn't have the strength, the ability to hold liquid in the same way that porcelain did. And it was also very beautifully painted by the Chinese. And so the Chinese would buy up a lot of the spices, including aromatic woods, sandalwood, which I'll talk about later on. And so here's a map of China. And it's good, you could also explain to the students that China is the third largest area in population, but first in third largest country in the world in area, first in population. And so it's still massive today. And the other important area of the East was the areas belonging to Ryukyu, Japan, and Korea. So some people may not know Ryukyu, but Ryukyu Islands is the islands where Okinawa is. And we know Okinawa because of the army bases there or military bases there. But before, in the early modern period, the period that we're talking about, it was a very important trading nation to Southeast Asia, particularly to Malacca. And also it played this intermediary role because it went around. So if you think of this as the Ryukyu Islands, it went around picking up products from Japan and from Korea and even China. It went to Quanzhou here and picked up Chinese goods and brought them all together to Southeast Asia. So these areas then were coming to Malacca because each area, the West as well as the East, was seeking the goods from the other side. And so Malacca very quickly developed into a successful port city. And because of the location, a secure location from the winds, a place where the people could harbor and exchange goods, they were able to develop facilities to help these traders, like shipwrights to make repairs on ships, supplies for ongoing voyages, underground storage so that they wouldn't be destroyed by fire, fixed weights and measures, and stable government, all the things that were necessary to make a port successful. And because all these goods were brought there and were waiting for the change of the monsoon winds to go home, many of the people began to exchange with each other. And so you find that there was a lot of exchange as well in Malacca, not simply as a way station, but also as an import-export station. And one of the major reasons for its success was because of their allies, the sea people, who were very good salespeople, very good shippers, who controlled the sea lanes and protected the goods from pirates, from other pirates, as well as bringing international goods. So these sea peoples live around the southern end of the South China Sea, and they control the straits where these goods were going, and therefore they were a very important part of the community. And Malacca was also an Islamic center. and a literary hub. And you had many Muslims arriving there, and much of the ideas were shared in Malacca. So you have here the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, and it is written in Arabic. But the Malay version, the Malay language was written in a modified Arabic script. It was called the Perso-Arabic script. And this was how the languages, how the chronicles and their stories were written. And I've indicated two of the stories here, which were popular among the Malays. So Malacca was a cosmopolitan and hybrid city. And so what I demonstrated here, that the reason was that the traders were mainly, in fact, almost all men. And so what they did was to marry or cohabit with local women. And so you get a rise of these mixed populations. There are a large number of them. You could mention a few: Malay Chinese, called the Peranakan Chinese, Malay Indian, Jawi Peranakan, mixed Portuguese and local, which were called Cristang by the Portuguese, and also Asian Christian converts. So you have a hybrid Creole mestizo community in the port. And what characterized this community is they spoke more than one languages, and they were able to move very comfortably between cultures. And as a result of this mixture, you also had a mixture in the culture. Language, they have a mixture of languages. Food, particularly food, which is very well known in Malacca, very good mestizo food, or Peranakan food as they call it. Religious ideas, architecture, and even the arts. And the reason is Malacca was a typical port city, being a gateway of all kinds of movements of peoples and cultures. And here are just some of the pictures that you might want to show. Here are these two Baba Nyonya. They're Chinese, mixed Chinese-Malay women, still wearing a Malay dress, but being very strongly Chinese as well. You have a Portuguese mestizo, and you know this by the wearing of the hat and the shoes as a way to demonstrate that they were Portuguese, even though they were mestizo with a local woman. And here is a freed man, a former slave. And here is a very interesting one that I wanted to show you, is of a Portuguese mestiza with the attendants. And one of the slave attendants is carrying an umbrella, and the other slave attendant is carrying a beetle set, a beetle chewing set. And these were two signs of status in the native world, and this was picked up also by the Europeans. And so I wanted, and this might be something that the students would be interested in, the beetle nut. It was a way to greet your guests. And so the first thing you do when they come into your house is to offer them the beetle nut. And so what the beetle nut is it's a nut itself from this is the actual fruit. You cut it open, there's a nut, you pound it, and you use the nut, you place it in one of the leaves of the beetle tree, and then you sprinkle lime. And this is lime taken from coral. This is not lime juice, coral. And you put it in your mouth and you chew it. And what it does is it creates a spittle, a very red spittle, and you've got to get rid of it. You can't swallow it or you get feeling nauseous. And so you get a spittoon. And so I'll show you in a minute one of the spittoons as well. But the end product is that it makes your teeth red or black. And some of the Southeast Asian claim that beetle nut chewing actually preserved the teeth. Might not look very nice, but it actually preserved the teeth. And so here is another of the mixtures. Here I took an example from the Philippines, but you could find it elsewhere. Here is a Filipino man, mestizo, Chinese mestizo, Chinese Filipino man. He's wearing a barong Tagalog, and this is one of the styles in the period. And here's a mestiza, a female woman wearing Spanish lace and Spanish clothes. So that this kind of thing did go on in the port cities. And here's a very interesting one that I think you would probably like. Two women, one obviously a mestiza here, another a European or Mestiza, and then the slave girl carrying the dishes. But notice also you have European gilded mirrors here, large Martaban jars. These are jars from Myanmar. You got Chinese ceramic pots here, and a spittoon for the beetle chewing, and Chinese or European teas and sauces. And through the window, you have a local cook. And oftentimes these food that they had was a mixture, and it tended to have a lot of spices, including pepper. And so the food of the mixed group tended to be hotter than usual. And then finally, they have new cultural aesthetics in which you get, once they realize what the market wanted, people would produce these for the market. So the Europeans noted that the Indian textiles were wonderful, but they wanted the Indian textiles, but they wanted European designs. And so they sent the designs to the Indians, who then copied the designs onto the textiles and sold it back to the Europeans. Or you have something like this. It's a Chinese porcelain bowl decorated with Arabic style lettering, which was made by the Chinese for the Muslim market. And so you got these kinds of cultural aesthetics. And so I'll just stop here, and maybe you can, for you to consider some of these questions that I've noted here. So the second part, what I'm trying to do now is to deal again with the question that I posed in the very beginning about early colonial empires, and trying to look at the impact of the colonies on the people. And so what I tried to explain to you is that there is a difference between the early colonial period and the later colonial period. And this is based on the idea of the early period being very different. And because in the early period, it differed. So if you look at the very bottom here of the screen, in the early colonial period, the Europeans had very little effective control over the entire local economy, and didn't have much control also over the interior population. And they were basically a seaborne empire. And why were they hugging the coast? The reason is that there were so few Europeans, and they had to then rely on their superior armaments as well as their ship technology. So they were able then to maintain themselves on the coast because they had access to the sea. And so what you see is the creating of an empire linked by ports. And this is the network of ports that form the seaborne empires. And so you can talk about the Portuguese seaborne empire, the Spanish seaborne empire, the Dutch seaborne empire. In fact, people have written about those things. So because of the period framework that we're doing here, the 16th century was when the Spanish and the Portuguese had the greatest impact. Then the Dutch in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the Dutch perhaps were among the most important, influential. English East India Company in this period was very limited to the last period of the 18th century and the 19th century, as I'll explain. So when we're talking about early colonialism and we're talking about seaborne empires, we're basically talking about the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Dutch. So here is just the background that you can use to give the students some idea of the time frame. So Malay Malacca, which I had talked about earlier, was seized by the Portuguese in 1511. And then it held it for over a century, and then was conquered by the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, in 1641. And so what the Dutch did when they took over from the Portuguese was to simply reverse the ruling classes. So now the Dutch were there instead of the Portuguese, Catholicism was kicked out, and Protestantism brought in. And at that time, there was an ongoing war of independence between the Dutch, who were under the Spaniards. And so there was great enmity between the two, particularly against Catholicism. And the Dutch in their records called the Catholics papists. And so you had these kinds of enmity, which showed up in the city itself, where all the various Catholic missions and orders and everything else were kicked out and taken over by the Protestants. And many of them fled further east for safety. And I mentioned that the East India Company, English East India Company, EIC, only occupied Malacca from 1795 to 1818. And this was only because at the end of the 18th century, in 1795, Napoleon invaded, you can ask students if they know about Napoleon, invaded and took over the Netherlands. And so the English and the Dutch who had fled asked the English to take over their settlements in the east to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Napoleonic forces. And this is the reason the English took over Malacca from the Dutch from 1795 to 1818, and then returned it to the Dutch. So they had very little real say in the period that we're looking at. Now here I wanted to show you, it's an early map that was produced by the Portuguese, claiming that this was what it looked like when they first conquered it in 1511. What you should note here is there's this river in the middle here. That's the Malaca River, the very important river that leads into the interior. And that's what I showed you earlier, all these buildings along the edge sides of the river. And so what you find is that if you come down the Malaca River, and this is the way that Europeans talk about right bank and left bank, as you go down the river, according to Europeans, the right bank is to the right side when you're going down river, and the left bank is on the other side. So here they talked about the right bank being where the traders were, ethnic traders. So all of these little spots here are illustrations or representations of various villages or settlements of different groups, like you had the certain Indian groups, Chinese groups, Siamese groups, and so forth, living in this area. And on opposite side, across the river, would be where the settlement was. And so under the Malays, of course, this is all wooden, and the ruler was in here, and then the settlements were back here. And so the Europeans copied this factor of using one area for the trading ethnic quarters and the other for the rulers themselves. Now here's another representation after the Dutch took over. And so it's a very interesting view from the sea. And so this is the Malaca River that I had explained before. And here is where the ethnic traders were. And here is where the Dutch established themselves. And then you had their church on the hill. So that they all tended to create a similar kind of pattern, but putting their mark onto the pattern itself. And here I've given you some pictures that you could show the students as well. And here's the gate of the Portuguese fort. The fort was called A Famosa, the famous one. And now today, if you go to Malacca, that's the only thing standing is the gate. And that's the part of the original wall. And then you get, then after the Dutch took over in 1641, you have the churches being, the Catholic churches being removed or taken over. And then you get the Dutch Protestant church here, the Christ Church, and you got the interior here, you can see. And also right here is the Dutch City Hall. And this is here, right here. So what you find in Malacca is the remnants of the various groups that had lived in the area. Now, what I'd like to do is now to turn very quickly to the environment itself and the impact on the environment. So we've talked about spices, but as important for the the Europeans in the 15th and the 17th, even into the 18th century, was sandalwood. It was an aromatic wood, which was valued throughout the world. So now, of course, you can buy sandalwood, so-called sandalwood fans, but they're really just sprinkled with some kind of perfume or whatever. They're not real sandalwood. Real sandalwood was very valuable because of the nature of the tree. The tree doesn't grow in forests. They grow individually, and they are parasites. They live off the roots, the nutrients of surrounding trees. And so it is, you cannot cut them all down because you need them to sprout and start finding places where they can survive, like trees around them. And here on the right, you see the wood itself. It's dried, ready for the market. And to give you an indication again of the impact on the environment, sandalwood tree already in the 17th century was being denuded from many of these islands. There was an island called Sumba, which I'll show you in a minute, which was called the Sandalwood Island because it was known for its sandalwood. But by the 17th century, by the end of the 17th century, there was no sandalwood there anymore. And areas of Timor, which is the largest supplier of sandalwood, was stripped of the trees already by the end of the 17th century. So this is the kind of thing that if you're looking at impact on the environment, this is what happened as a result of huge demand, not only of Europeans, but of Asians for sandalwood. And so when you show the students where these are, it's very good to kind of have a picture where they are, because they're tiny areas. Again, we are looking at the very end of the map of Southeast Asia down here. And this is the island of Sumba, the Sandalwood Island, and this is Timor, the island of Timor. Two of the principal suppliers of sandalwood in the 15th to the 18th centuries. And the other environmental change, which you could examine as well to show the impact, is the clove tree. The clove tree used to cover those islands that I showed you, the tips of the volcanic mountains. So that, as I pointed out, they simply broke off branches whenever there's anybody at the port who wanted some cloves. But once the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century, they demanded that the local inhabitants don't give them branches. They wanted only the clove itself. They wanted the people to pick the cloves, dry them, and then bag them in preparation for the Portuguese ships that were going to come annually to pick up the cloves. So what this required is a great amount of labor, far greater labor than before, and greater organization. And one of the things that the Europeans wanted, not only the Portuguese, but the Dutch, is they wanted to deal with only one person. They wanted to deal with a ruler, even though this wasn't really the case before. The trees belonged to everybody. But now you then had the ruler getting all the money and then redistributing, so that the hierarchy, of social hierarchy, is changing, and the people are being made to do work that they never did before. So you get the impact on the local population. Now, what was even worse was what the Dutch did. So when the Dutch went in, they were a very powerful company. There was the largest by capitalization of all the European companies, and it had powerful ships. Holland in the 17th century was one of the leading areas of technology in the world, in engineering, in ship technology, and so forth. So when the Dutch came in, they really were able to take over and monopolize. So in order to assure that no one else would have cloves, they forced the people to exterminate, or the Dutch called it extirpatie, eliminate all their clove trees except for certain areas that they designated. And so what happened here was not only the destruction of the forest, but also this massive use of labor, forced labor, the local people, to cut down these trees. And they were very hard trees to destroy, because you not only had to cut them down, but you had to see that they didn't sprout back. because the clothes would get into the soil and new trees would come up. And so it was almost impossible. So they had to not only cut down, but they had to burn them. So this took out a lot of labor and caused tremendous hardship among the people. So these are, again, environmental impact. And perhaps even a worse case of the impact of the Dutch on the environment was in the nutmeg and mace producing islands of the Bandas. And here what they did was, because the Banda Islands were so resistant to the Dutch, and didn't listen to what the Dutch wanted, they attacked them in 1621, very early, and totally tried to kill off every one of the inhabitants. And perhaps not more, it is said, not more than 1,000 were able to flee, settled in other islands, and the rest were killed. And so to control the nutmeg tree then, the VOC brought in these Dutch burghers. These were Dutchmen who had served the VOC and now were freed and were given tenancy to these Banda Islands, and they were called percaniers, gardeners, and they were there to grow the nutmeg tree with slave labor. And so they brought in lots of slaves, the Dutch did, lots of slaves from neighboring islands. And you did have then the creation of a mixed population as well in the Banda Islands. But you can see the destruction it made on the island, particularly on the people. So you can look at that and explain as well how the early colonial regimes through the seaborne empires wreaked havoc on the environment, not only on the trees, but also on the people themselves. So one of the things you can do is to look at why is Malaca so important to study today? I heard a bit of the discussion that was going on before I came in. And it is important, I think, for you to be aware that students will want to ask you, why do I have to study this? And so one of the things you could do is try to kind of do comparisons. Someone talked about Long Beach. You can Fresno, there, Los Angeles, San Francisco. What you can do is try to say to them, what is there a similarity or difference in their function? What do they do? So when you look at Malaca, for example, you know, it was an entrepôt. It's also a trading place, not simply a port. So you can talk about that. In people, so do you have the kind of mestizo culture that you had in Malaca? And what are these kinds of mestizo culture? Or do you have just a very strong cosmopolitan background where you have so many different inhabitants living together? And then in culture, what kind of culture do you have? Do you have a mixed culture, a kind of hybrid culture? Or do you have a kind of a Los Angeles culture? You know, kids can start thinking about it. What do they consider to be part of that culture? How do they explain this culture? And then also in terms of nature, what is the nature of that city? What is the role of that city with other cities around the region? Because what I tried to explain was Malacca was linked to a lot of these other coastal cities. What is the nature of the cities in California? But one of the things that is also important is to mention that what is important about Malacca is the fact that it was a cosmopolitan, a hybrid city that developed into a world-renowned city. So if you want to take an example, you can tell the students, can you think of another city that's close to Malacca that was like Malacca, but is Malacca today? And you could say Singapore. If you look at Singapore, it's doing exactly what Malacca is doing and just as successfully. So this could be a way into maybe even discussing some of the things that made Singapore strong and rich. And it's because they did the same thing as Malacca, filling in what was necessary in order to attract traders from the outside world.
And that is it for our Q&A and for our keynote today. I want to thank you, Leonard, again, and thank you to all the teachers for hanging in here with us.